Well, good morning, guys. Let's give a hand to the hands that fed us this morning. Appreciate you folks coming in and getting it all done. Appreciate Gavin being here and keeping us where we can hear things well. So Genesis 26 is where we are this morning. And I want you to I don't know if you saw this, there was an interesting TV show that came out a few years ago. It's probably about 10 years ago. But it's called The Man in the High Castle. I don't know if anybody saw that. But the premise of the show was that what if we lost World War II? What if instead of kind of winning in World War II, Germany took the eastern half of the United States and Japan took the western half of the United States? And those who were Americans were under the rule of Germany and Japan, depending on where you lived. And really fascinating show, but in many ways, that's kind of who we are as Christians. We have to decide where our citizenship lies. And this is what our men's advance is going to be about, okay, is we're going to talk about what does it mean to have a citizenship that's in heaven, but living in Babylon or living in Germany or Japan or wherever it is that you might consider if you're in occupied territory, because we're living in occupied territory. So that's kind of where we're going to go in our content in our speaking time at the men's advance. But if you haven't done the men's advance before, y'all, it is so much fun. I'd never shot sporting clays before, and the last couple of years that I've gone, that's just been a highlight of my year, getting to go and do that. It was just so much fun. And I mean, I love golf, so it's like shooting stuff with golf. I mean, it's just kind of almost got some parallels to it. So I hope you'll go if you've never been before. You will walk away with your bellies full and hopefully your heart's full. And your fellowship will be full too. So, all right. So Genesis 26. Last week in Genesis 25, we kind of ended with a couple of things. I mean, we saw the death of Abraham, and we saw the birth of Jacob and Esau, and we learned about an Esau trade. Remember, we kind of talked about that toward the end. And Esau trade is just kind of trading the ultimate for the immediate. And we didn't linger here long, and not as long as I would like to have, but there's just something I don't want us to miss, okay? Esau goes down in history as the guy who didn't just make a bad choice, okay? Not just as the guy that we kind of laugh about because he traded his Hot Wheels, collection for that one worthless car. Okay, I talked about that as an example last week. But Esau was known as the guy who despised his birthright. I mean, he carelessly devalued the promise of God. He was potentially in the covenant line, but God knew ahead of time how his kind of position was going to be. But he traded and devalued the promise of God for junk food. Okay, I mean almost literally kind of what happened. And as the reader, as we're tracking along with this dysfunctional family of faith, as the reader, we're challenged to deal with the question, or maybe the question is just kind of implied. Where do we discard the promise of God for junk food? Where do we do that? So this is a big chapter. There's a lot to sit with. I would love to have lingered and still would love to linger with that a little bit longer. But this week we come to Genesis 26, and I want to kind of tell you up front, this chapter is a little different. It's a little different from some of what we've had. It's the only chapter in the Bible that we have that's fully dedicated to Isaac. Okay, Isaac is pretty much the only character in this book. We don't have Abraham in this chapter. We don't have Jacob in this chapter. Esau only shows up at the very end, but it's just Isaac, okay? And Isaac is kind of standing alone between these two giants that we have between Abraham and Jacob. And we look closely at Isaac and what happens with him. And honestly, this story that we see about Isaac is a little bit uncomfortable, and it's also deeply encouraging because I think many of us can kind of relate to this at a personal level. So he is a guy who makes some of his father's mistakes. He struggles with fear. He fails his wife. He gets pushed around by his neighbors. And yet God blesses him. So Isaac is not the conventional hero that we often see even Abraham showing up as, and eventually maybe even Jacob. But God blesses him, God pursues him, God appears to him, and God makes room for him. And this is kind of what we're going to see in Genesis 26. This is the story, and it may be one of the more personally relevant chapters that we've studied yet. So let's dig in verse 1. Now there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech of the Philistines, all right? So here we have this word, famine, okay? You remember that, right? So this is the same crisis that pushed Abraham toward Egypt when we look back into chapter 12. And Isaac's response is identical to Abraham's. His first instinct is to go to a foreign king. Okay, and this is what Abraham goes toward Egypt and toward Pharaoh. And the narrator of this story is kind of setting this up intentionally. There's a parallel that the writer is wanting us to see here. He's wanting us to see the similarity. So father and son in the same situation, the same initial move. There is a country song out right now, I don't even remember the name of it. But it says something like, I did this just like my daddy did, just like his daddy did, right? Just because your daddy did it doesn't mean it's okay. Just don't mean it's right. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about your daddy. Now, we're not going to scrap in the parking lot or anything like that. I'm not insulting your daddy. But I do have a lot of both men and women sometimes, but especially guys that I'll talk to on a regular basis. They'll say, well, I did it just like my daddy did it. I'm just like my daddy. Well, just because you did it like your daddy doesn't mean your daddy was right. Sometimes that needs to change, right? And Isaac needed to kind of learn that lesson, and he'll learn that lesson as we'll see here. So verse 2, and the Lord appeared to him and said, and this is different, right? So Abraham went on down to Egypt, but in this case, God steps in and he says, the Lord appeared to him and he said, do not go down to Egypt and dwell in the land of which I will tell you. So before Isaac gets there, before he makes his father's mistake, God appears to him and stops him. Okay, now, when God appears to somebody, what's that called? It's a theophany, right? So so we're getting our theology words down. So this is not just in a dream. This is not just God hinting at it in Isaac's thoughts. Isaac has this moment where God appears to him and says, Isaac, stop the direction you're going and alter course. Okay, so this is a theophany. So this is the same kind of language that we see in some of the Abraham narrative. And this is God saying to Isaac, I appear to your father, I'm going to appear to you also. Okay, so the instruction is specific. And what he says is, do not go to Egypt. So Egypt represented what? We've talked about this. What did Egypt kind of represent? When you look at Egypt all through Scripture, what does it kind of represent? Yeah, it's the world. It's the human resources that are, that we perceive Egypt to be the place that's going to bail us out, okay? So it represents human resources. It represents human security, human solutions to problems that really God needs to solve, right? So this is kind of what Egypt, the role that Egypt kind of plays. But God is saying, stay in the land of promise and trust me here. Okay, so stay in the land of promise. Don't run toward the world's safety net when mine is right here in front of you. I've got you. I'm with you. All right. So in Genesis verses 3 through 5, we see really kind of the full covenant reinstatement here. So let's look at this. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For to you and your offspring I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath that I swore to Abraham your father, and I will multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven, and will give to your offspring all of these lands, and in your offspring all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now, this is just kind of one of the richest passages that we see in Genesis 26. God restates the Abrahamic covenant to Isaac. Okay, so all the ingredients, presence, land, offspring, blessing, all the nations. He gives this directly to Isaac. And I want you to notice what God says first. Okay, so before he promises land, before he promises descendants, before he promises blessing, what does he say? He says, I will be with you. Okay, now the covenant begins with a relationship and not real estate. Right? And God is not primarily in the land distribution business. He's in the presence business. This is what God is about. Everything else flows out of that for Isaac. So, but notice the connection to Abraham in verse 5, because Abraham obeyed. And this is not saying that Isaac inherits the covenant because of Abraham's performance. And Paul's clear about this in Romans chapter 4, if you look at this. But what God is pointing to is this pattern of faithful covenant relationship that he had with Abraham. And it was out of that relationship that the actions flowed, that his obedience flowed. And this is kind of what God is saying to Isaac as well. I am with you, right? And because I am with you, that establishes an identity in who you are, in your obedience. If you believe that I am with you, your obedience is going to flow out of that. Now, Isaac needed this. He needed to personally receive this covenant promise himself. He couldn't just ride on his father's faith. And that's the thing about us, guys. I mean, we can't inherit faith. We can inherit a tradition. We can inherit church attendance. We can even inherit the language of faith and kind of get some of the jargon down. I mean, we can get that, but we can't have a personal living relationship with a living God unless that's something that becomes our own, right? There is one of my favorite moments as a pastor. By the way, I mean, some of you, you hear me make reference to being a pastor. Coming out of seminary, I was going to be a youth pastor for life. I was a youth pastor for about 8 years. I was a pastor in a little country church for a couple of years. I had a couple of church starts. So all in all, I was a pastor probably for about 5 or 6 years. And the whole time, God kind of had his finger on me and was saying, okay, I have counseling for you. It is a pastoral role. It is not a change of calling. It is a change of direction. So that's kind of my calling story all in about 15 seconds. But one of my favorite stories when I was a pastor, and I may have told this before, but it's priceless. There was a guy that was in our church. He was about 80, and he big old fella. He was about 6'4" and 300 pounds, and I baptized him, man. And that was one of the hardest working baptisms I think I've ever done. He was a big boy, and I was not. But he was in his 80s. He grew up in Medina. His family, if I said the name, you'd probably know it. But his family owned about half of the farmland in Medina. And grew up in church all of his life. Served in church. I mean, he was a deacon in a church before he came to our church. Raised his family in church. He was just one of those every time the doors were open kind of guy. I mean, he was just there. He was a piece of furniture in a church his whole life. And his story is that one day, he was out mowing his grass, and the Lord spoke to him. And what the Lord said to him is, you have just blended in. You don't have a personal saving faith of your own. You have just blended in. And man, you talk about some humility that it took for him to be able to come to his 28-year-old pastor at the time and say, I'm not saved. I don't think I'm a Christian. And I want that faith for myself. And he had already prayed on the lawnmower, to receive Christ in that moment and to take ownership of his own faith in that moment. And he wanted me to baptize him, right? Man, it's never too late to examine to see if you're in the faith. If that faith is something that belongs to you and it's not just something you got by osmosis in the culture. And what God was doing with Isaac is he was saying, it's not enough for your father to have received the promise. This is a promise that I'm giving to you. So that's a question for you this morning is your faith genuinely your own? Do you have a personal living relationship with God? Is it something that it really belongs to you, or have you found that you have just blended in to culture? Now, God has just appeared to Isaac. God has spoken directly to him. He's just promised his presence in his covenant faithfulness. And you would think, okay, that would be like life-changing, that there would be this pivot in Isaac's life when you have God like really appear to you and say these things. But look at what happens next. Verse 6. So Isaac settled in Gerar, and when the men of the place asked him about his wife, he said, are you ready for this? She's my sister. What? For he feared to say my wife, thinking lest the men of this place should kill me because of Rebekah, because she was attractive in appearance. You can't make this stuff up, guys. He lied about his wife. And that hopefully that sounds familiar, because he did it just like his daddy did it. Okay? His father Abraham did the same thing twice. Okay, Genesis 12, also in Genesis 20, both times in fear. And guess what? In the same location. In Gerar. This is where Abraham was when he lied. Same lie, same failure, same place, same time, same station, right? This is generational sin, okay? This is one of those examples of he did it like his daddy did it, and it was the wrong thing to do, okay? He watched his father operate out of fear and deception. And he absorbed the pattern, and he reproduced the pattern, and he didn't even modify the story. I mean, it was the same script that was kind of passed down from his father, and he just kind of read his lines. I mean, he didn't really change much in the plot in this. And what's devastating about this moment is that God has just said to him, I will be with you. You have no reason to fear. And he's acting as if God is nowhere within 1,000,000 miles of him in this moment. You ever been there? Do you realize, okay, and this is just a really clear pattern, that some of our most dangerous times of temptation is right after a supernatural moment. Right after a moment. So guys, if you go to the men's advance, let me just tell you, the next week is going to be rough. Don't be surprised. Maybe not. Hopefully not. But don't be surprised if the next week is rough. You go to the men's advance and there's something that God says to you and speaks to you. Don't be surprised when you get to work on Monday or wherever it is that you go, that there might be some challenging things that begin to happen, right? And this is kind of the case here. Just as soon as he has this revelation from God, I mean, there's this fear that just overrides this with stunning speed, okay? Now, in this moment, Isaac fails his wife, and this is just kind of we got to kind of look at this honestly. He placed his own safety above her protection. Literally, he uses her as a human shield. He says, she is my sister, and he does this to deflect danger away from himself. And he puts this onto her. Now, let's slow down for just a second and think about what that actually means. I mean, do you realize what he's doing here? I mean, he is putting her in a position where she's going to be taken into Abimelech's harem and pretty much can be selected at random for the king's sexual pleasure anytime that he wants. Now, in this particular case, and in at least one of the times with Sarah, we see that God kind of steps in and he protects her, right? So that's not what happens here. And we'll see even in Abimelech's words here in just a moment that there's an implication that fortunately it didn't happen. But yet this is what Isaac was willing to do. Okay? Now, before we get too hard on Isaac, let me just say this. The pattern that we see of people sometimes using other people to manage our own fear, and particularly us as husbands, using other people to manage our own fear and our own anxiety is sometimes one of the more common and one of the more destructive things that I see in doing couples work. Okay, it shows up in ways that are a little bit more subtle. I mean, we don't have Abimelechs in our life. We don't have foreign kings that we're offering our wife to be sexual with. But yet, it can show up as us withdrawing emotionally. It can show up as us being dishonest. It can show up as us being controlling, as us avoiding things. And what we're kind of doing is we're allowing our wives at times, not everybody all the time, to kind of be thrown under the bus in the process. So a couple of examples of this. Your wife is hurting and she needs your presence. And you go silent and you just pull away because if she's having emotions, that must be bad, right? Or you have a family member that may say some critical things about your wife and you're like, hey, I'm not getting in the middle of this. I'm Switzerland. And you kind of throw her under the bus. Or rather than kind of doing the hard work of communication that it takes to connect with a wife, with a woman, you take care of yourself. You don't do the hard work of it, but you buy stuff and you work harder and you avoid, or you may even turn to other things like pornography because you say, well, I'm just going to take care of myself. I'm not going to do all that hard work. Or you let her carry the load of spiritual leadership in your family. In all of those cases, we're not a lot different from Isaac. We're kind of putting her out there, and y'all are looking at me like deer in the headlights, man. But we can be guilty. I can be guilty of doing that, right? So before we're too hard on Isaac, let's translate that into modern day life and the kinds of things that we do to kind of hide behind our wives at times. And guys, there's just going to be a moment where sometimes we got to grow a pair and we got to be willing to do the work that it takes to step in and to lead her well and to love her well. And sometimes that means we get outside of our own comfort zones and do things that don't come naturally to us. But guess what? That's what makes it an act of love, right? For a guy to be able to step back and say, well, no, I just don't do that very naturally, so I'm just not going to. Well, that's a cowardly way to approach a relationship. When we get outside of ourselves and we do the things that it takes that we're not comfortable doing to love our wives well, then that is what makes it an act of love. Okay, marriage counseling sermon over, sorry. All right, verse 8, okay? So when he had been there a long time, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, we remember him from Abraham, same guy, okay? He looked out the window and he saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. Now, I'm not sure what she found to be all that funny, okay, in that moment, but apparently he was trying to make light of the situation. And there's just something about when you see a couple, you can see that there's something between them. It was, and I don't think there was anything romantic or affectionate about this moment, but what Abimelech saw was the connection that they had. So he called Isaac and he said, behold, she is your wife. How could you say she is my sister? And Isaac said to him, because I thought lest I die because of her. And Abimelech said, what is this that you have done to us? One of the people might easily have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So apparently, him giving her up was not just for the king's sexual pleasure. There were other people that might have been involved in this, but God protected her, and Abimelech's words kind of tip us off to that. But what happens is that Isaac gets caught. And notice who catches him. Abimelech, he is this pagan king. He is a Philistine. He's not a part of the covenant promise. He's not a part of the people of God. But he's the one that has the spiritual discernment to see what's going on in this moment. And it's one of the most uncomfortable moments that we have in all of Genesis, because we have this guy that doesn't even know God's moral character. And he is the one that really confronts the patriarch of promise, okay? The one that has just had the promise reiterated to him. So Abimelech is outraged, and he understands immediately, what the consequences could have been. Now, why does he understand this? Yeah, because when the same thing happened to him with Abraham, God appeared to him in a dream and said, dude, I'm going to take you out if you follow through with this. You're going to die. So Abimelech has memory of this. He's like, we're not doing this, okay? I know what happens here. Do you realize, Isaac, all the stuff that could have gone down had this actually unfolded in the way that it could have? So he kind of has this moment where a pagan king steps in and interrupts this process, okay? But what's Isaac's explanation? Fear. That's all. That's it. Nothing else. And that's the whole explanation, is just simply fear. He was afraid, so he lied, so he endangered his wife. All right, verse 11. So Abimelech warned all the people, saying, whoever touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. All right, so there's kind of a grace that's hidden in all of this mess. God uses this pagan king not just to protect this couple, but also to protect the covenant line, right? Because, this is, I'm not really sure about the order of this. You don't hear much. You'll see Esau, so we would assume that they're already born. But there's still a protection over the promise that God is using Abimelech to interrupt and to get into. And he gives this royal decree that nobody's to touch Isaac or Rebekah. And despite Isaac's failure, despite his fear, and despite his deception, God's purposes just are not going to be derailed. Okay, even though Isaac did the very best that he could to mess it up, okay, God's will in this moment is not going to be taken out, all right? So the covenant line is protected. And the thing I want us to be able to see is that God's faithfulness is not conditional and it's not based on our performance. So no matter how bad we mess things up, God's still going to do what God's going to do. And it could have been that the covenant ended here with a patriarch just kind of lying to this pagan king. God could have just said, Isaac, you're an idiot. I'm not going to allow the covenant line to pass through. I'm changing my mind. Okay? But he chose not to do that. It didn't end because the covenant is not based on Isaac's performance, but it rests on God's character in this moment, and it doesn't rest on our character either, right? So this is the same kind of grace that holds us, and that's something that's of comfort. So another question for you. I'm kind of throwing out a few different discussion questions, so you can take any of these and talk about them at your tables in a little bit. But a discussion question is, where in your life does fear cause you to act in ways that causes you to compromise your integrity or fail the people around you? Okay, maybe you don't always give in to that temptation, but where does your life, sometimes what happens in your life that brings fear that may tempt you to either compromise your integrity or to fail some of the people around you? Where does that temptation show up for you? Now, a little bit of transition because the chapter begins to shift somewhat dramatically here because after Isaac's failure, it says that God blesses him. Okay, so not after Isaac gets it all together, okay, not after Isaac repents in some spectacular fashion, just God blesses him because God chooses to, all right? So let's look at verse 12. So Isaac sowed in that land, and he reaped in the same year 100-fold. The Lord blessed him, and the man became rich and gained more and more until he became very wealthy, and he had possessions of flocks and herds and many servants, so that the Philistines envied him. So 100-fold harvest. In a famine, just kind of let that sink in. They're in the middle of a famine. And Isaac has 100-fold harvest with his crops. Now, 100-fold was pretty extraordinary, okay? 10-fold would have been a blessing. 10-fold would have been something that kind of made people stop and stare, but 100-fold, all right? Now, this is not farming skill. This is not, it's not anything that Isaac did. This is just the blessing of God because it's so extreme, there's no other explanation for it. But it creates this problem, okay? His neighbors now envy him. His blessing now makes him a target. Look at verse 15. Now the Philistines had stopped and filled with earth all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. And Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you're much mightier than we." All right? So there's this kind of passive-aggressive kind of thing that Abimelech has said, hey, nobody touches Isaac or Rebekah. But then after he has this 100-fold blessing of a harvest year, they're kind of intimidated by this. And there's this, and we're going to see how this circles back around here in a little bit. But even Abimelech, he's probably the most discerning pagan that we have in all of the Bible. But even Abimelech is somebody that recognized, man, God is on this person, and I'm not sure what to do with that. I've come close to dying twice, and it's going to be better that I'm not going to lay a hand on him, but it's going to be better that I get him very far away from me. So what does he do? Okay, he has his cronies come into the camp in the places where Isaac's wells are, which is maybe it's watering his herds, it's watering his family, maybe watering crops, we don't really know. But they sabotage the wells. Okay, they take dirt and begin filling up the wells that Isaac has. And these are just kind of sending a really strong message to Isaac. You're no longer wanted here. Okay, you're not one of us. You need to pack up. You need to move on. You don't have any roots here. We're erasing your history and your ability to provide for yourself. So he is expelled. Isaac is expelled. He moves. He doesn't fight. He doesn't retaliate. He just packs up and goes, okay? So he goes to the valley of Gerar. Look at verse 17. So Isaac departed from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped after the death of Abraham. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. So he digs. He's run off. And he digs. He doesn't sulk. He doesn't spiral into bitterness. He doesn't start a war. He just picks up a shovel and goes to work. This is what Isaac does. And he renames these wells, okay, after the same names that his father, he did it just like his daddy did it, gave him the same names that his father had given him. And he's kind of honoring this covenant heritage. He's honoring his father in a way. It doesn't remind us, we'll probably go back and look at what the names were. But the names are going to change, and we're going to see this in just a second. Verse 19. So when Isaac's servants dug in the valley, they found there a well of spring water. The herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, "The water's ours." And they dug another well, and they quarreled over that also. And here's where he changes the name. So he changes the name, or he calls the name the Sitnah well, and they quarreled over that also. So they called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well. And they did not quarrel over this. For now he calls I think I skipped one, but he calls this one Rehoboth. Okay, Esek was the other one that I skipped. But the Lord now, so the third one he gets to, okay, this is the first, there's two that met opposition, okay, and he names one Esek, he names one Sitnah, okay, and then the third one he comes to, Rehoboth. Okay, we've got Rehoboth Methodist Church going out toward Dyersburg. Okay, I've done a marriage conference out there. And I never knew until right now, okay, what the name of that means, and that's the Lord made room for us. Isn't that a great name for a church? You know, Rehoboth United Methodist Church, I think it's what they were. Now it's Rehoboth Church. And it's just the Lord made room for us. And the Lord made room for us, he's going to make room for you. I think that's a great name for a church. All right, so 3 wells, okay? Each of them renamed, all right? One of them Esek, which means contention. The other one Sitnah, which means opposition. And then the third one, Rehoboth, which means God made room for us. So they dig the first well and somebody claims it. They move on to the second one. They get pushed off of that one too. And then they dig the third one and nobody fights them for it. So Isaac names them, all 3 of these. The ones that he had named, he kind of lost those and gave them new names, right? So this is kind of important because Isaac is kind of processing his circumstances probably both emotionally and theologically. Now, I want to say this, guys. Every single one of us in this room knows what it's like to experience defeat. We know what it's like to experience failure. We know what it's like to have moments where we blow it. Okay, I mean, in the consequences that unfold, we have to own those. But we also know what it's like where somebody else does something that we can't control that brings harm to us. And sometimes that's opposition. Sometimes that's bullying. Sometimes that's just not a battle worth fighting, but we wind up suffering as a result of that. Guys, you know what I spend most of my time doing as a therapist? Is I help people name the harm that has come to them. That's a part of really processing emotions and seeing the story of God beginning to unfold as he redeems us in spite of those defeats, in spite of those times that we've blown it, and in spite of those times that others have harmed us. When we're able to name those things, there is some freedom that comes with that. And this is what Isaac was doing, okay? He wasn't pretending that the opposition didn't happen. He's not minimizing the loss, but he's naming it. He's saying there was confrontation here and there was opposition here, but he also keeps digging, Okay, he keeps moving forward. He doesn't stop at Essek. He doesn't stop at Sitnah. He moves and he digs again, and eventually he gets to Rehoboth, and he gets to this wide open space, this room, okay? And it's there that he winds up having fruitfulness. Now, guys, we don't always get Rehoboth on the first dig, right? Wouldn't it be great if we did? I mean, the first time we put ourselves out there and we say, hey, I'm going to do this, then all of a sudden fruit just starts flowing. It doesn't always work this way. I mean, Isaac's known what it was like to have a lot of fruit somewhere, but then that got sabotaged and he had to move on. And now all of a sudden he's hitting walls, right? So sometimes we're going to do that. We're going to hit walls and we're going to hit another wall, but on the other side of the other wall is a Rehoboth. On the other side of the other wall, there's this place where there's fruit, where God is going to return and begin to bless once again, all right? So the opposition is real, and we don't need to pretend that life is just going to be filled with 100-fold blessings all the time. There are going to be times that we have to pull weeds. There are going to be times that we've got to do the work that it takes to be able to move past this defeat and on to the next one, all right? But the man that quits at Sitnah never finds Rehoboth, right? So when we give up early and we stop digging, then sometimes that's where things just dry up and we die, right? So think about Isaac's theological dilemma in this. I mean, he had this 100-fold blessing, but now he's hitting these walls. And he's probably asking himself the question, did I just not hear God properly? I mean, or maybe did God just not come through? Has God abandoned me in this moment? We tend to think those things when we have defeats. We tend to think those things sometimes when we have opposition. So here's another question for you. Where is your Essek or your Sitnah? Okay, where has it been? Where's been a place that maybe you worked and you invested and you poured yourself out only to find pushback and opposition and failure, right? So maybe that's a part of the conversation. So what would it look like to keep on digging? What would it look like to just not quit? What would it look like to name some of those moments that were not your favorite moments in your life and say, God, what can you show me in this? What can you teach me from this? All right, verse 23. From there, he went up to Beersheba, and the Lord appeared to him that same night. So here's another theophany. He says, I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not, for I am with you, and I will bless you, and will multiply your offspring for my servant Abraham's sake. Right? So God appears to Isaac for the second time we see in this chapter. And in the first two words that God says to him are fear not. I love that. This is not an accident. I mean, God knows probably the mental condition of his servant in this moment. He's been expelled from Gerar. He's been contested at two different wells. He's been pushed out of at least three different locations. And he's starting over again in a new place, still in a famine as far as we know. The famine hasn't resolved. So fear would be the most natural thing in the world for Isaac. And God doesn't say, Isaac, suck it up, buttercup. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say stop being weak. He doesn't say toughen up. What he says is fear not. And then immediately he reiterates what he said at the beginning of the last time that he was with Isaac, and that is fear not, for I am with you, right? I am with you. So the antidote that we see in Scripture when it comes to fear is never willpower, okay? It's never just kind of a pep talk. It's never self-talk. It's never, just generating some kind of courage from the inside. The antidote to fear is always, without exception, the presence of God. Fear not, for I am with you. And it's probably the most repeated command that we find all in Scripture. How many of these are in Scripture?
For every day of the year.
Yeah, so as far as we know, I hear this, 365, fear not. So one for every single day of the year, all right? So, I mean, that's something that God's pretty intentional about, reminding us. So when Jesus is born, right, the angel of God comes, and one of the first things that he says is, fear not. And he says, there's going to be a child that's born to you, okay, and his name's going to be who? Emmanuel, which means God with us. The presence of God is with you in the living flesh. And in Matthew 28, Jesus is ascending to go in to be with the Father. And he says, fear not, for I am with you, okay, always to the end of the age. So God's promise is something that gets repeated. There's a little bit of just kind of a broken record that God has with that, is that his message to us is fear not, for I am with you. When my presence is with you, you have nothing to fear, right? So the promise to Isaac is kind of really the promise of the whole gospel. You know, God just coming to be with us fully in the person of Jesus Christ, all right? Verse 25. So he built an altar there, and he called upon the name of the Lord. This is something Abraham did. And he pitched his tent there, and Isaac's servant dug the well there. So Isaac responds through worship. He builds an altar, and then he also goes to work, right? And these are not necessarily in competition. We can worship and work at the same time. So Isaac is bringing his whole life, his spiritual life, his practical life into the presence of God. And that's the same kind of thing that we're called to. He prays and he labors, he worships and he plans. And that's kind of an integrated life, okay? This is where our worship and our work come together as our expression of love to God's covenant faithfulness to us. And it's the model that Genesis 26 is kind of holding up to us, all right? All right, verse 26. We see Abimelech coming. So when he went to him from Gerar with Uzzah, his advisor, he says that, why have you come to me? Isaac says, why have you come to me that you hate me and that you've sent me away from you? So why are you coming back around? Because I know that you've hated me. And he says, we see plainly that the Lord has been with you. So we said, let there be a sworn oath between us, between you and us, and to come and make a covenant with you. So Abimelech is circling back around, and he's coming to Isaac's tent, and remember, this is the guy that expelled him. This is the guy that sabotaged his wells, and he's coming back around and he's saying, hey, can we have a covenant? I think it'd be really a good idea for us to just kind of, have an agreement, kind of have a treaty. And the thing that he recognizes is that God is on this man. And what Abimelech is saying is, we want to be on the right side of this. Okay, we want to make sure that we are on the right side of what seems to be happening in our land here. And we see Isaac's response. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't demand justice. He doesn't lobby for his rights here. He dug wells, and he's just letting God do the work of fighting for him. And then in verse 29, that you will do us no harm, just as we have not touched you and have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord. So he made him a feast. So Isaac made him a feast. And they ate and they drank. In the morning they rose early and they exchanged oaths. And Isaac sent them on their way, and they departed from him in peace. So Abimelech comes, and he has this repair conversation with Isaac. And we see in the next couple of verses, in verses 32 and 33, that they've been digging this well. Isaac's servants come after this repair conversation has happened, and they say, hey, the well is made. We've got water flowing here, okay? The same day that peace is made, we see the well come in, and the covenant is kind of ratified, and the water is now flowing, okay? Now, the last thing that we see here in this chapter is kind of this interesting kind of highlight, and you would think that this chapter would end on a high note, but we see this, and I'm going to talk a lot about this. I want us to get onto our tables, but in verse 34, when it just kind of shifts gears, when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beriah the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and for Rebekah. Isn't that an interesting way to end a chapter? Right? So they have all of these moments. I don't know if, Isaac and Rebekah had gone on a walkabout and left the boys at home. I don't know how this had happened, but Esau comes in here at the last minute, and there's just cold water that gets thrown on all these warm feelings that Abimelech and Isaac have been ushering in. And Esau comes in and says, hey, Mom and Dad, I've gone exactly outside of God's instruction, and I've married people that are not our people, and aren't you proud of me? And they're like, no, not at all. As a matter of fact, you'll see even in the next chapter that Isaac and Rebekah have this conversation, and they say, man, I hope Jacob doesn't do what Esau did. Can you believe this? And so it says that it made life bitter for Esau, or for Isaac and Rebekah. All right, I want us to pull up and stop there. Talk about any of those questions that we threw out there this morning at your tables, and just kind of where some of that may have landed for you. And even if you get back to Esau and talk about Esau just chasing his appetite once again, we can have a conversation about that. But spend a little time talking about these at your tables, and pray for each other before you go. Share some prayer requests, and I'll see you guys back here next week for Genesis 27.